Rain lashed against the pavement as a fragile white cane struck the polished marble steps of the St. Regis Hotel. Inside, New York's most ruthless crime syndicate held court. When she stumbled directly into the Don's chest, the entire room held its breath. Then he whispered a single terrifying word. Lexington Avenue was a cacophony of blaring yellow cabs' frantic curses and the relentless drumming of a sudden torrential downpour. Lydia Hayes tightened her grip on the strap of her BAM Supreme polycarbonate cello case, letting the heavy, familiar weight anchor her against the surging crowd. To be blind in New York City was to navigate a turbulent ocean entirely by sound and touch. To do it during a flash flood was practically a death sentence. Her white carbon fiber cane swept left and right in rhythmic, practiced arcs, but the rising water was quickly masking the tactile feedback of the pavement. Her shoes were already soaked through. Desperation clawed at her throat. She needed shelter, and she needed it immediately. Through the roar of the storm, she heard the distinct muffled hush of heavy revolving doors, and the faint, elegant strain of a string quartet playing a Vivaldi piece. A hotel lobby. Guided by the warmth radiating from the building and the subtle scent of expensive lilies and floor wax, Lydia pushed her way through the heavy brass doors of the St. Regis. The immediate silence of the grand foyer washed over her, a stark, comforting contrast to the chaos outside. She paused, shaking the rain from her dark hair, her chest heaving as she tried to orient herself in the vast, echoing space. She didn't know that she had just walked into the epicenter of a war. Less than 50 feet away, Cassian Moretti was descending the grand staircase. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned not just the building, but the very lives of everyone inside it. Clad in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that clung flawlessly to his broad shoulders, Cassian was the undisputed head of the Moretti Syndicate, the most feared organization on the eastern seaboard. A heavy platinum Rolex Daytona peeked from beneath his French cuffs, a cold testament to his immense inherited wealth. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed men, led by his ruthless underboss, Matteo. They had just concluded a brutal negotiation in a private suite upstairs. A rogue faction from the Romano family had attempted to siphon funds from the Moretti's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Cassian had dealt with the traitor, personally leaving a broken, bleeding man on the Persian rug of the penthouse. Cassian's adrenaline was still running high, his dark, calculating eyes scanning the lobby for threats. He was a man who trusted no one and forgave nothing. "Bring the armored convoy to the front." Cassian ordered Matteo, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute obedience. "And have the Romano warehouses in Brooklyn burned to the ground before midnight. Leave no witnesses." "Consider it done, boss," Matteo replied, reaching for his earpiece. Cassian took another step toward the exit, his mind already shifting to the logistics of a full-scale Mafia war. And then it happened. Lydia, disoriented by the sudden shift in acoustics and the lingering panic from the storm, took a hurried step forward to find a concierge desk. Her wet heel caught the edge of a slick marble tile. She lost her balance, her heavy cello case throwing her violently off-center. She pitched forward, her hands flying out to brace for a painful impact with the floor. Instead, she slammed into a wall of solid, unyielding muscle. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Her white cane clattered loudly against the pristine marble, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous lobby. In a fraction of a second, the atmosphere in the St. Regis shifted from luxurious tranquility to lethal tension. Click, clack. The unmistakable terrifying sound of 6 Glock 19s being drawn and racked filled the air. Matteo and the bodyguards instantly formed a tactical semicircle around their weapons trained directly on the soaking wet girl, who had dared to breach Cassian Moretti's personal space. "Step back!" Matteo barked his finger, tightening on the trigger. Lydia froze her heart, hammering wildly against her ribs. She couldn't see the guns, but she could smell the sudden metallic tang of gun oil and the sharp scent of aggressive aftershave. She could hear the rustle of tailored suits and the heavy, synchronized breathing of men ready to kill. Terror paralyzed her. She was trapped against the chest of a man who felt like a statue carved from granite. Cassian had reacted entirely on instinct. When the figure tumbled toward him, his combat reflexes had flared. But as his large, calloused hands gripped her shoulders to shove her away, he looked down. Time seemed to fracture and grind to an absolute halt. He saw the long, dark hair plastered to her pale cheeks. He saw the panicked, sightless hazel eyes staring blankly at his collarbone. And then his gaze locked onto the delicate crescent-shaped scar resting just beneath her right jawline, a scar he had paid the world's best plastic surgeons to minimize 10 years ago. Cassian's breath hitched in his throat. The cold, calculating Mafia, Don, a man who had just ordered the deaths of dozens of men without blinking, suddenly looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His grip on her shoulders softened, shifting from defensive aggression to a desperate, possessive hold. "Boss?" Matteo asked, confusion lacing his aggressive tone. "Give the word." Cassian didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the terrified patrons cowering behind the lobby pillars. His eyes were entirely consumed by the trembling girl in his arms, the girl he had spent a decade watching from the shadows, the girl he had promised to protect at all costs. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, and whispered a single terrifying word that sent a shockwave through the room. "Mine." The word wasn't a claim of property. It was a desperate vow, laced with a decade of hidden guilt and an obsession that defied all logic. The absolute silence that followed Cassian's whisper was deafening. Lydia trembled, her heightened senses rapidly processing the overwhelming stimuli. The man holding her smelled of rich Tom Ford Oudwood rain and the faint, underlying metallic scent of fresh blood. "Put the guns away," Cassian commanded. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal authority that brooked zero hesitation. "Cassian, we don't know who—" Matteo started. "I said put them away!" Cassian snarled, shooting his underboss a glare so venomous it made the seasoned killer take a physical step back. The sound of weapons being holstered rippled through the lobby. Lydia finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. I'm sorry. I couldn't see. I slipped. Please just let me get my cane." She tried to pull away, but Cassian's hands remained, firmly, yet gently planted on her arms. "You're not going back out there," Cassian said softly, his tone completely shifting from the monster he had been seconds prior. He reached down effortlessly, retrieving her fallen white cane and pressing it gently into her trembling hand. "Matteo, take her cello. Carefully. It's a late 18th century testore. If you scratch it, I will take your hand." Lydia gasped. How could a complete stranger possibly know the exact make and era of her prized instrument? Before she could protest, Cassian draped his heavy, dry cashmere overcoat around her shivering shoulders. "Walk with me, Lydia." Hearing her own name fall from this dangerous stranger's lips sent a jolt of pure ice down her spine. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" she demanded, trying to dig her heels into the marble. But his forward momentum was unstoppable. He was guiding her through the revolving doors surrounded by a shield of heavily armed men. "I am someone who owes you a debt," Cassian replied cryptically as they stepped out into the storm. A massive black Mercedes Maybach S65 armored limousine was idling at the curb, its rear door already held open by a stoic driver. "I'm not getting in a car with you," Lydia shouted, panic finally overriding her shock. She swung her cane defensively, but Cassian simply caught it mid-air with lightning speed. "Lydia, listen to me," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a desperate, intense register. "Vincent Romano's men are currently kicking down the door of your apartment on West 74th Street. If you go home tonight, you will die. Get in the car." The sheer conviction in his voice, coupled with the terrifying mention of an invasion at her home, shattered her resistance. Numb with shock, she allowed him to guide her into the plush, heated leather interior of the Maybach. Matteo carefully placed the cello case in the trunk before climbing into the front passenger seat. As the heavy armored doors sealed shut, cutting off the noise of the storm entirely, the car merged seamlessly into the chaotic New York traffic. The drive was agonizingly silent. Lydia sat rigidly against the door, clutching her cane like a weapon, while Cassian sat opposite her, his intense gaze entirely fixed on her face. He poured a glass of Macallan 25 from the car's crystal decanter and placed it gently into her hand. "Drink. It will stop the shivering," he ordered softly. She took a small, burning sip, the liquid fire grounding her. "Why is someone trying to kill me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I'm a cellist. I play at weddings and symphonies. I don't have enemies." "You don't," Cassian corrected, pouring himself a drink. "Your father did." Lydia's head snapped toward the sound of his voice. "My father, Thomas Hayes, was a corporate actuary. He died in a car crash 10 years ago." Cassian let out a heavy, cynical sigh. "Your father Thomas was a brilliant man, Lydia. But he wasn't an actuary. He was the chief financial fixer for the Moretti crime syndicate. My syndicate." Lydia's breath caught. "You're lying. My father was a good, boring man. He worked in a cubicle. He worked in a secured vault deep beneath the Diamond District." Cassian countered his tone, devoid of malice, only heavy with a grim truth. "He laundered hundreds of millions of dollars for my father. He was a ghost in the financial system, the best we ever had. But 10 years ago, the Romano family found out who he was. They wanted him to turn over the ledgers." Cassian leaned forward, the scent of his cologne enveloping her. "That car crash on Interstate 95. It wasn't a drunk driver, Lydia. It was a Romano hitman named Victor. Your father swerved his sedan to take the brunt of the impact so you would survive in the passenger seat. The shattered glass took your sight, but his sacrifice saved your life." Tears pricked Lydia's unseeing eyes as the buried trauma of that horrific night violently resurfaced. The screeching tires, the shattered glass, her father's final choked gasp holding her hand in the wreckage. "Why are you telling me this now?" She sobbed, the whiskey glass shaking in her grip. "Why ruin my memory of him? Because Vincent Romano just found out that Thomas Hayes's daughter is still alive," Cassian said, his voice tightening with suppressed rage. "He thinks your father left the encrypted ledger with you. They were at your apartment tonight to torture it out of you." The Maybach smoothly pulled into a private subterranean parking garage, the heavy steel gates slamming shut behind them with a definitive clang. "For 10 years I have watched from the shadows." Cassian confessed the vulnerability in his voice, a jarring contrast to his intimidating presence. Lydia's mind raced as pieces of her life suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. "The anonymous scholarship to Juilliard," she whispered. "Funded through a shell corporation in Geneva," Cassian confirmed. "The experimental corneal surgeries at Johns Hopkins, paid for in cash," he replied. Cassian reached across the console, his large, warm hand gently enveloping her trembling fingers. He didn't force the contact, allowing her to pull away, if she chose to, but she was too stunned to move. When my father passed, I took over the syndicate. Cassian said, his thumb lightly tracing the knuckles of her hand. I swore on his grave that the debt we owed Thomas Hayes would be paid. I promised to keep you safe. You were never supposed to know about me, Lydia. You were supposed to live a beautiful, ordinary life in the light far away from my darkness. The car door opened, and the cold air of the underground garage rushed in. But tonight the darkness found you, Cassian said, stepping out and offering his hand to guide her. Welcome to 432 Park Avenue. You are standing in the most secure fortress in Manhattan. You will stay here until every last member of the Romano family is eradicated from this earth. Lydia gripped his hand, stepping out of the car. She had stumbled into the St. Regis, seeking temporary shelter from a summer storm. Instead, she had walked directly into a golden cage, held captive by a Mafia don who had secretly orchestrated her entire existence. The penthouse at 432 Park Avenue was a sensory fortress, suspended a quarter of a mile above the chaotic streets of Manhattan. For 3 days, Lydia existed within a world of absolute suffocating luxury. Her bare feet learned the topography of heated Afghan silk rugs and cool imported Carrara marble. The air was perpetually climate-controlled, carrying the subtle synthesized fragrance of white tea and fig. Yet despite the opulent comfort, it was a high-altitude prison. Cassian Moretti treated her with a terrifying, reverent obsession. He rarely slept. Lydia could hear the heavy, measured pacing of his handmade Beluti Oxfords on the hardwood floors late into the night. He fed her elaborate meals prepared by a private Michelin-starred chef, provided her with racks of silk loungewear, and spent hours simply sitting in the corner of the grand living room, listening to her play her Testoricello. But beneath the surface of this gilded cage, a Mafia war was boiling over. The Romano family, desperate and cornered, was tearing the city apart looking for her. Sirens wailed endlessly from the streets below, a distant symphony of the chaos Cassian was orchestrating to crush his enemies. On the 4th evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse shattered. Matteo burst through the double mahogany doors, his heavy breathing audible even over the sonata Lydia was playing. "Boss," Matteo's voice was tight, urgent. "Vincent Romano just made a move on the Teterboro airstrip. They intercepted a shipment of our heavy artillery. It's a bloodbath. They have our men pinned down in Hangar 4. Cassian cursed the sound of a heavy glass tumbler slamming onto a table echoing through the room. "Vincent is getting desperate. He knows we are closing the net. I need to be there to coordinate the extraction." "It's risky, Cassian," Matteo warned. "It could be a distraction." "I don't have a choice. If I lose that shipment, the Commission will view it as weakness," Cassian snarled. Lydia heard the metallic scrape of him loading a magazine into his customized Sig Sauer P226. He crossed the room, stopping inches from where Lydia sat with her cello. "Lydia," he said, his voice instantly softening, dropping an octave into that possessive tone that made her skin prickle. "I have to leave for a few hours. The building is on total lockdown. The elevators require biometric clearance. No one gets in or out." "Are you going to be safe?" she asked, her voice trembling perfectly, projecting the image of the terrified civilian he believed her to be. "I am always safe, Mia Luce," he murmured, his knuckles gently brushing her cheek. "I am leaving Daniel to oversee your personal detail. He is my top captain. You have nothing to fear." With a sudden rush of cold air and the heavy thud of the reinforced doors, Cassian and Matteo were gone. The vast penthouse fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. Lydia sat perfectly